All right, Sam. The topic for today, it's a big one. It's a big one. I hope you're ready.
Oh, I'm ready.
It's the question. It's the question for anyone that's listening to this. How do you teach someone?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Any trainer or learner should probably know how to answer that because there's some science behind it, right?
There is. Well, I mean, yeah, it is like the most foundational thing, but it's so funny because most trainers didn't go to school for like I feel like teachers go and they learn all of like they go for years of education to learn how to teach children pedagogy or andragogy and all that science behind it. And most people in training never did any of that.
Right.
Which is interesting. But I feel like, so in our world, there's two that I always refer to that I hear all the time. You probably have heard a third one, but I feel like everyone's got a framework for how you teach somebody. And so there's the classic, like tell, show, do, review is the framework for how you teach somebody. You tell them, you show them, you make them do it, and then you review it. We at Chipotle, and I've seen a bunch of other people using variations of this, used introduce, shadow, perform, validate. I'm going to introduce the topic, shadow me doing it, then you perform it, and I'm going to validate you can do it. That's kind of the framework for teaching somebody. Are there others? Have you heard of other ones?
I feel like they all follow that same standard method, though. I like tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if that's a teaching methodology, but I like that. I like that framework. Yeah.
It is probably a teaching methodology. It does remind me, I've heard that and so many people say that. And then there's this old book that one of my old heads of training used to make me read called Telling Ain't Training that I always think through that I'm like, it's probably poor form to put that in their face, but
yes, exactly.
Big difference between telling and training.
Yeah. It's probably just the introduce part, just that.
That one we got. You definitely have to introduce what you're going to say, set the context. So here's what's interesting about it. I did this deep dive research years ago into like, where did all this come from? Because I, like, as a curious learner myself, was trying to figure this out and I had no idea. And so I don't even know if this is like the true origins, but this is as far back as I've gone, which is, I think, interesting to go back in time to like, where did this come from? Where's the history of this? And is it still applicable to like, how did we get here today for teaching somebody?
Okay. So just to clarify, you're about to break down the origins of systematizing teaching methodologies. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm going to do. That's exactly it. We're
Nice.
going back in time. We're going back in time. So it fascinated me, the evolution of this. So where I went all the way back to, it's this topic called training within industry. So if you Google training within industry, you'll get all this stuff. But what it took me back to was like 1930s, 1940s America during the wars, and having to teach a bunch of new factory workers, because a lot of the factory workers were now at war overseas, had to teach a bunch of people, and came up with this methodology for training a bunch of people, like Rosie the Riveter era, to come into the workforce.
Right.
And there's all of this like great old videos on YouTube. They're still out there from the Department of Labor that are a great watch for trainers.
Let's roll it.
If you want to go check that out. Right, roll the clip. Let's watch some of it.
Well, there's your machine. It's all set up. Here's the material you're working on. Now all you've got to do is put each tube in the jig with the threaded end at the open end of the jig. Tighten up on your thumb screws. Hold the jig solidly under the drill. Put a little oil on the drill. Then when you start drilling, ease up on the handle so the part won't climb the drill and bust it. Okay?
Well, I guess
Swell, go to it. I'll be back in a little while. Oh, and by the way, read your safety book before you start to operate.
Great clip. That was a
great
solid
clip. That was good.
Honestly, better than some training videos that are out there today, if we're being honest.
Right?
If we're being honest.
Still applicable, maybe.
Still applicable. I mean, definitely applicable. So the 4-step process that they were teaching in this, although a little uncomfortable watching it live, but the 4-step process made sense and I think is a continuation of where we are today. So the 4-step process from the 1930s, 1940s America was prepare the worker, present the operation, try out performance, and then follow up. And there's some sub bullets within it. We can throw it up, but prepare the worker, present the operation, try out performance, and follow up. And then there's this subline that I think is great that summarizes all of it, which it says, if the worker hasn't learned, the instructor hasn't taught.
Oh.
And so to me, I saw this, I went back in time and I was like, well, wait a minute. I'm using tell, show, do, review, because that's what somebody told me. This is the same thing. Prepare, present, try out, and follow up. And so I was like, well, that's interesting. The more I researched then, this became the foundation. Training within industry was what was taken to Japan that then became kind of like the legendary Toyota manufacturing processes that became Six Sigma and became this whole like operational methodology that now, to me, what like my interpretation is this is now what we're using in tell, show, do, review, or this is how we defined at Chipotle, introduce, shadow, perform, and validate was based off of this research. So crazy that it started way back there, went to Japan, came back to America, and is now what we're using in restaurant operations today.
Wow. And so it's really, it seems like it's popular when it's talking about like a large workforce. I mean, is that typically where you see this being used, or is it also like just basic, like one-to-one classroom learning?
Yeah, it feels like it's still one-to-one because like the concept makes sense that like before you're going to teach somebody something, give them some context, show them the right way to do it so they can see the right way for it to be done, and then let them
present it to the worker.
Exactly. Yeah. They got it right the first time. We're all just copying and ruining it. But like it makes sense. You do this with children. Like, hey, let me show you how to do that. Let me tell you, this is what I'm doing. Let me show you so you see the right way. Now let me see you do it. I feel like it's human nature. They just kind of codified what makes sense naturally, whether it's kids or restaurant workers. I use the same thing in tech right now. If I'm teaching somebody digital marketing or I'm teaching them how to leverage data, it's the same thing. Let me show you what I'm doing. Now you try it until I trust you to go do it on your own. I feel like it's applicable everywhere.
And I think that, I mean, it's applicable, but there's also something about, I'm not sure kind of what the right way to describe this is, but when I think of that, it was done originally in factories, right? It was adopted by industry. I think there's something to be said by it would never have been adopted by industry. It would never have been adopted by businesses if it also wasn't efficient, right? I think at the end of the day, it's also just efficient and effective. It's probably just the fastest way to get somebody up to speed is probably what they found.
100%. And like, I'm sure we all still hear the stories of some, like you hear somebody saying like, hey, that person doesn't really know what they're doing. They're really struggling. And you break it down and it's like, well, nobody taught them how to do it. So how would you expect, like we still expect people to kind of figure stuff out. And I would assume that like this framework also came from, it's much more efficient to not assume people will just figure stuff out, to put some codified process in place to teach them the thing rather than just pray they figure it out on their own.
So this methodology sort of evolved with, it was based on a need, right? Teaching and validating and efficiently teaching a large workforce. And we've gone through, I guess, the next step of that, the next evolution or revolution of that is being able to teach a large scale workforce with digital training, digital learning, digital content. And that's, a lot of our experience, a lot of what we do. And it seems that really is it's more about kind of that front end, presenting to the worker or the introduced shadow. Is that where you would kind of put, I guess, digital content when it comes to training and learning? Does it fall squarely in the category of tell and show?
It does. And it's it's such a good point, Matt, because I feel like we see people in the industry just leveraging digital training to do everything. It's now your trainer holistically, when really all it can do is introduce a topic to you. Maybe if it's on a screen, show you some things, but all it's doing is giving that context. So it's the introduce and like maybe the beginning of the shadow to show you how to do something the right way. But there's nothing about digital training that gets to perform. I think in like this post-COVID world, we're all seeing this with like, how do you use digital content with training in schools and in restaurants? And no one stepped back to think through like, well, how do you teach somebody and where does this fit in? And how do you make that transition from using digital content to introduce a topic to somebody to then transition to the human, let's see you do it in action and perform and then validate that in real life. And that's like a really nuanced transition to go from digital messaging at scale to in-person performing and validating. But that if you're going to teach somebody something, that's how you use digital, introduce it, and then you've got to figure out the transition into real life, which I feel like the whole world is still figuring out how to do that the best way possible.
Right. And it's like the fallacy, I guess, of an e-learning course or a training video is that, you know, someone will watch it and know what to do, but it's really just that for those first two steps. And the power of it is it you know, it makes it consistent for all 500 or 1,000 or 100,000 employees that you have. So they all get the same introduce and they all get the same, at least parts of the same shadow, right? But when people rely solely on the digital content, clearly it's not enough because then they don't get validated. They don't get the review. They don't get the apply aspect of that.
That's right. Like you did this a ton. I remember like you shot a ton of recipe videos. And what's interesting is like when you go all the way back to the chef that came up with the recipe, there's always like subtle nuance that over time gets lost when teaching something. But like shooting a recipe video and using that to introduce the recipe for everybody lets you go all the way back to the source and the person that created it to show you all of the nuance of what they're doing and how they do it. And now you can say all thousands of my workforce will get the exact same message. And I don't have to worry about it getting lost in translation or people forgetting the details. So there's like ensuring some consistency way up front to then perform and validate it. You leave that to the in-person, but you've done that a ton. I feel like on the codifying up front and like really capturing that to make sure that it's consistent, but the right consistent.
I think recipe videos is such a great example. Or I guess even how-to videos, how to do a procedure or a recipe, because you can get richness in the introduce. I mean, there's been times because I love to teach. I love trivia and I love education. So there's been times when we took it way too far. It was like the history of the avocado and what region it originated from and the origin of like, you know, it comes from two Aztec words, meaning I don't even remember off the top of my head, but it meant or no, the word guacamole came from two Aztec words. That means avocado sauce. You know, and going into like, you know, a deep dive into like the information, so maybe not everybody needs to know that level of introducing a recipe. But I also think of it. I also think, you know, a recipe is shadow. I do think it can't replace an in-person trainer. It doesn't replace shoulder to shoulder training, but at least it lets somebody shadow a procedure being done in what is quote unquote the perfect way to do it, right? The way that's been deemed approved as the correct way to do a procedure or a recipe. And in working with different brands doing recipe videos, in my mind, the goal is always like, let's at least give something so that a new hire can shadow it done exactly how we want everyone to do it. If they're just in case their trainer is not necessarily, you know, letting them shadow something that is like the best way to do it. They have something that can be introduced and shadowed that is consistent for every single employee and quote unquote perfect kind of across the board.
It makes so much sense, especially when you're striving for consistency across dozens of places. I feel like this is always the catalyst when you hear people can run like one great restaurant or they can run one great team. But all of a sudden, when you've got multiple teams, multiple restaurants, Like when you can't be there every day, the consistency starts to drop because people forget the details, people start making stuff up, or they just forget. And this digital training in that introduce step of training is the consistency as you scale, to make sure that we're all starting from the same foundation. We all know the right thing to do. Without it, that's the hardest thing to replicate. I feel like that's why so many brands struggle to scale, is because they're relying on humans to remember everything and to go to every location to do it. And it's so hard to scale that way when you're relying on tribal knowledge and humans to remember everything.
All right, Sam. Well, thank you for the history lesson. I love that. Tell me, what were the 4 things again from the 1940s training video, or how to train?
Prepare the worker, present the operation, try out performance, and follow up. And if the worker hasn't learned, the instructor hasn't taught.
I love it. Awesome.
So good.
Well,
So good.
I think that's about good for today. Until next time.